Good morning. I'm Joyce Martin, and on behalf of the Labriola National American Indian Data Center, I'd like to welcome you to the Labriola Center and to say how happy I am to have Dr. Brenda Child here today, Professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota, here to speak with us today about her award-winning book, My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, Ojibwe Family Life and Labor on the Reservation. Now, before we begin the program, I'd like to thank a few people without whom this event would not have been possible. First, I'd like to thank Dr. David Martinez, the chair of the judging committee, and the members of the judging committee, Dr. Mila Vicente Carpio, Professor Simon Ortiz, and Dr. Catherine Osborne. And I'd also like to thank the students who work in the Labriola Center. They always help with setup of the room, and also with Margaret Schmidt for arranging the catering. So without them, all of this would not be possible. I'd also like to thank the ASU Library's Business Operations Manager, Lily Johnson, for all of her hard work on behalf of the book award, and also Associate University Librarian Phil Canomas for his continued support for this book award and all of our events here in the Labriola Center, and as well as our new university librarian, Dr. Jim O'Donnell. So we do have refreshments in the classroom, so please help yourself. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Phil Canomas, who's going to say a few words here today.
Well, I'm only going to say very few words because I'm anxious to hear the discussion. I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to congratulate you, Dr. Child, for the award that you are receiving today. This is the 7th year that we've done this award. Each year it gets a little stronger. We were very fortunate to have something of the caliber of your book to judge. We had a distinguished panel led by Dr. Martinez. These are things that we want to move forward with. We enjoy the receptions, we enjoy putting on things, but we hope that you'll stay with us for the more difficult things as we move forward. It's our hope that to create a Labriola Center that'll be a spot that students can use, that faculty can use, and researchers can use. And we hope that you'll stay with us and join us on this journey. So, I think I have the best job today because I get to award you the plaque. And so, again, thank you so much. And I will turn it over to Dr. Martinez, and you're on.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Joyce. Squeeze into my chair. All right, well, we'll get underway. Thank you one and all for being here this morning on this auspicious occasion. The format for the event today is I'll interview Brenda for 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open things up to the audience for Q&A. And so I want to begin by acknowledging my friend and colleague, Brenda Child. We were longtime colleagues at the University of Minnesota, and I've had the pleasure of watching Brenda grow and prosper as a scholar and teacher over the years. And this is the approximately the 15th anniversary of your first book, Boarding School Seasons. Time really flies. It seems like it only came out yesterday, but it's achieved a much-deserved place in the boarding school literature and American Indian scholarship. And so wherever you see scholars today talking about the Native boarding school experience, you'll inevitably see Dr. Child's book cited. And so it's a particular honor to have her as this year's award winner for the book that came out recently, My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, Ojibwe Family Life and Labor on the Reservation. And it's come out to rave reviews, both in publication as well as among our peers in American Indian and Indigenous Studies. And recently, in a Star Tribune book review, dated May 1st, so this is hot off the press. Robert Franklin wrote in the Minneapolis Star Tribune that Brenda Child tells the story of Indian survival in deeply personal ways and with fresh insights in her latest book, My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, Ojibwe Family Life and Labor on the Reservation. The tribulations on an outpost of imperialism are not new. But Child, a professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota, surprised even herself in her exhaustive research, especially on the historically large role of women in reservation economics. And so with that, welcome, Brenda. And I'll start with my first question. Tell us about the origin of this book. What was the idea you had in mind when you started, and how did you develop this into the book that we have today?
Well, that's a great question, and I just want to say as I get started, thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here and so honored to have this award. You know, it's amazing I can even remember the origins of this book because it's so long ago, right? And many of us take a long time for our books to kind of come to fruition. But a long time ago, I'm thinking, you know, it's been over a dozen years ago, I started to think about, I was asked to write an essay talking about Ojibwe people during the Great Depression and what was going on with Indian people in the upper Midwest. And so I started to look into the history of wild ricing labor. And that's sort of the origins of the book. And when I started doing this work on wild ricing labor, and this is kind of where the book's title comes from. The story I tell is that when I was growing up and I was a kid, we had my grandfather's rice knocking sticks, which Ojibwe people still hand carve. They're made out of cedar. They're very lightweight for doing that kind of work all day long. And my grandfather had died right before I was born. And so I was sort of surprised that my mother brought these knocking sticks out because I must have been 13 or 14 years old, and I don't recall ever having seen them before. And when Ojibwe people die, we give away all their belongings. So it was sort of unusual to have these. And I don't know really where they were, where they came from, but we hung them on the wall. And she told me about the wild rice camps when she was a girl and what they were like. And I probably hadn't gone ricing until maybe I was about around that age as well. So when I thought about these ricing sticks and my mother's stories about wild rice camps, I was always sort of struck with, that it was family labor and how involved my grandfather was because we had his ricing sticks. So I went back and when I was doing research on this for this article, and I looked at the historical literature from the 19th century about what people were saying about the labor of ricing. And I was sort of stunned at the descriptions, which were often something like, in the late summer, early fall, 600 women gathered out on Rice Lake together to harvest wild rice. And I thought, well, that's not family labor. And there were no men at all. So I began to see this work as being very much large collectives of women laboring together. And it sort of changed my view of how things were done. And I was sort of shocked, right, to think that my grandfather, who to me represented tradition because he had been born in the 19th century, was probably the first generation of Ojibwe men to actually harvest wild rice. So what I thought was long-standing tradition was in fact adaptation and survival and people doing something new. So that's how it began. I really was interested in why it was that certain kinds of labor was done a certain way among Ojibwe people, maybe before reservations or during the 19th century, and why their work changed so much in the early 20th century on reservations, especially in regard to gender. So that was sort of the origin of the book.
So as you developed your narrative, were there any issues or problems you encountered as you started writing about your family as opposed to your nation as a whole?
I don't know if I had problems. I had actually something very fortuitous happen. And, if I believed in the history gods, I just thought they were really smiling on me. But, I'd finished a term as being chair of American Indian Studies at Minnesota. And in the fall, I had the semester off to return to my work. And I thought, I got to wrap this book up and write an introduction. And I had the idea I'd write an introduction about my grandparents' working lives. And I was up in Red Lake, and we were having a meeting about our only historic building on the reservation, which is the old 19th century old agency building. And we're trying to decide, like, do we love this building and want to just turn it down, or is it historic and do we want to preserve it? And so that was because we're building right now a new complex of tribal buildings. And so we were talking about that. But when I was there, one of my cousins happens to work in one of the offices in that building, which just is for small business loans, that sort of thing. And my cousin Roxy said, "Brenda, have you ever been in the vault room?" And I was like, I vaguely remember, you know how when you're a kid you explore buildings and everything, but I sort of vaguely remembered, oh yeah, there's like an old bank vault kind of room. She said, why don't you go in there and look around? She said, all the stuff in there is from, she just described it as when they were really nosy and intrusive about people's personal lives. And by them, she meant the Indian agents, because this is the old BIA building. So I went in there and started poking around a room of like a dozen or 15 or so file cabinets. And I discovered that there was a file for every person who lived on the reservation in the early 20th century, probably dating from, you know, very turn of the century to the 1960s and later. So I simply went over and plucked out my grandparents' file. Jeanette Oganosh had a file, Fred Oganosh had a file. So what I was intending, and make stuff up. I thought I'm gonna have to go around and talk to my relatives and remember you told me this story once. I suddenly had all this material. I had their household budgets. I had letters that the Indian agent had written about them. I had tribal judges commenting on various things about them. And, you know, I could see the years when my mother, who was their youngest child, was a girl, and what their household budget, when they went on ADC and things like that. So it was just, I just thought, here, this has been up here my entire life, just the exact moment when I want this, I figure out that this is there. Maybe it was stupid of me not to realize this stuff was there. But, you know, we have a tribal archive at Red Lake, which is things we'd gathered for court cases and from BIA records, and I just didn't realize this little archive existed. So that was why, so to me it was like, oh my goodness, I was, you know, you don't know how thrilled I was to find these two files. And their files were very different from one another because my grandmother had been to boarding school. She's the one who had inspired my first book, Boarding School Seasons, was bilingual, and she clearly was the family advocate. So she had lots of letters in there that she had written and responses. My grandfather spoke Ojibwe, and he wasn't the family advocate like she was. And so there was a real difference in it. Since this was the other interesting thing to see, just how much more power you had on the reservation if you spoke English. Now that seems like an ordinary thing to say, but a lot of times we think, oh, why did people start speaking English and abandon our wonderful tribal languages? It's like you needed, maybe you wanted a housing loan, or maybe you wanted, you know, basic survival depended on English on the reservation. And so that's what I could kind of see from those files.
Oh, indeed, and one of the reasons I asked the question that I did is for two reasons. One is that it was noted in your review that you embarked on a considerable amount of research, and so I'm wondering where your research took you beyond that original cache of items. Also, your book has fairly or unfairly been described as a memoir. And so I think in my mind these are two related questions.
Okay.
And so with respect to the research first, where did your journey take you?
Yeah, so the parts of the book that I wrote first were really the last chapters. So the chapter about ricing I wrote quite a long time ago and just sort of updated. And that really sort of shaped my view of what this book was. You know, I was sort of thinking of it as, you know, labor history of rural people and American Indians, and there's this interesting tradition of how people think about labor history in my field and American history as well, which is often thought of as urban industrial workers. And I thought, I want to, you know, mess with that and think about rural people and people who harvested wild rice and women as laborers and all that. So a lot of my work had been in, the collections of the Minnesota Historical Society and in the National Archives. So I needed to find out as much, as I could about how Ojibwe people were laboring in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so that was everything from lumbermen's journals or anything you could find where people commented on Ojibwe people's labor, to going into the National Archives and say looking at the records of our fishery on the reservation. So commercial fishing on my reservation dates from the First World War. Almost overnight commercial fishing began. What was sort of family camps of labor became commercial fishing. So I went and looked at our fisheries records in the National Archives. So I did a lot of research like historians do in archives before I wrote these introductory couple of chapters about my grandparents. So the book ended up being kind of a hybrid, because it is very much a memoir of my grandparents and their generation. And the way I look at the rest of the book about fishing, the labor of healing, which is another part we might want to talk about. And then the part about the history of commercial fishing among Ojibwe people, it really, that was sort of what I was after. And that part, I guess I describe it as more my grandparents' generation of Ojibwe people and how they made a living, because the story brings up them once in a while, but it certainly is more broadly about Ojibwe people of the Great Lakes.
Yes, I should segue into the main theme of your book, which is labor. When you read this book, I almost forget that labor is the theme, because what I experience as a reader is Brenda is telling me about life, the life that we all live as Native people. And so the fact that we work and work hard is just a natural part of that life. And so, but it is an important theme for you. And so, insofar as your book talks about different types of work or labor that you and your family and community undertook as they adapted to what, for lack of a better term, we call the reservation economy. For example, you do talk about fishing, ricing, jingle dressmaking, nursing, bootlegging, and welfare. And so, with these very complex examples in mind, what did you want your reader to learn about the notion of labor in the Ojibwe community?
I think there was really a lot I wanted to get across, but there was a lot I learned myself about American Indian labor through writing this book. I guess what I wanted to show people, maybe it was sort of a bit of a commentary on how often this is not something you might see in other areas of Indian country as well, but stereotypes of Native people, right? That we're not hardworking, we're on welfare, we're lazy, and these kinds of things, and I deal with northern Minnesota, right? So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I just wanted to show how hard Indian people had to labor on the reservation, the dozens of things they had to do. No one had the luxury of a single occupation, right? The dozens of things you had to do to survive the reservation economy. And so that was what I wanted to kind of get across, is how hard people worked in their everyday lives. But the other thing about labor to me was, and I kind of started exploring this with the Wild Rice book and then this last book I wrote about Ojibwe women. I just wanted to explore Indian culture and Ojibwe culture from the perspective of labor, because sometimes we think our culture is represented in our arts or our spirituality and those things, our language. Those things are certainly true. But a large part of how we express culture is through the work that we do and the work that American Indian people have done. And so that, to me, was just another way of exploring Ojibwe people and their cultural lives. And I think I want to kind of also get a message across to kind of contemporary young people about, how hard our grandparents worked to survive, and just to kind of see the example of that labor and to look at doing things. I mean, it sounds so obvious to say, but the things we do, like fishing, that we have this long and really incredible history with this, and that our grandparents and earlier generations continued to do these things was not just an important part of economic survival, but it kept us in our places sometimes, and it kept us on our homelands, right? And so it's just a very important expression of Native people's lives.
Yeah. Well, of course, I think we've all heard the stereotype of Indians being lazy and living off the dole. And it's a prevalent myth in mainstream society, despite how hard we do work. Having said that, what is the perception of the community of itself? Did you find that Ojibwe saw themselves as hardworking, or did they let that colonized myth shape their thinking?
That has it evolved to that people expect some
in other
of the
words, did
stereotypes?
Ojibwe see themselves as lazy and living off the dole as well?
I certainly don't think they did in the time period I'm studying, because everyone was working so hard. And even if you periodically went on welfare, as my grandparents did, it was just one part of a system, right? That Indian people were trying out everything, and if something new became available to them, they were going to try that out as well. And so, but in later generations, I have one of my very good friends at home runs the jobs program on the reservation, and he sometimes says things to me, because he works with young people, on the reservation, and he sometimes says things like, geez, it seems like our great-grandparents had such great work ethic, and I don't know if these 18-year-old kids have a great work ethic, and, trying to make sure no one's ever late for the jobs program and all this sort of stuff. And I'm like, so I just think, well, it's sort of easy for me, to kind of, I don't have to do that work day to day on the reservation like he does, but I can stand back and, just show him what our history is of labor, and that it's certainly something that our young people need to know about. It's not just in the Meday Lodge and speaking Ojibwe. This is part of our culture as well. This, not only the work ethic itself, but also just the kinds of work that we do. And many of those ways of doing things are still accessible to us. You can still go out and have a sugar bush and tap maple trees and do these kinds of things, which many people do, but not as many as, earlier generations.
Oh, indeed. And I think that one of the more impressive things about your narrative is the way that you display how innovative community members were. In Western terms, they might use the crass term entrepreneurial, but I think we need to find a different term for what was going on in the Ojibwe community. In particular, I'm thinking about your discourse on the jingle dress.
Right.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so another thing that surprised me, and actually Peter was part of this, a few years back, we were asked to go out to the University of Oklahoma and give lectures in honor of Wilma Mankiller, which was a really big honor to do. And I thought to myself, well, what am I going to do? And they told us like 2 years in advance. So you thought, you better show up with something. You've got 2 years to work on your talk, right? The first time I ever met Wilma, she told me a story about when she was first elected principal chief, and she came up to Red Lake because our tribal chairman had been in office for 3 decades, and she wanted to learn from people who'd been, doing this kind of political work. So she came up to Red Lake, she said, in January, and our tribal chairman at the time, this man named Roger Jordan, she said he gave me wild rice, he gave me walleye, and he gave me a jingle dress. And I just thought, well, how perfect, and it was kind of a nice metaphor in a way, because probably that the jingle dress, which originated as an Ojibwe tradition but is now widely popular with all kinds of tribes, that originated as a dance, and the songs associated with it are about healing. And Wilma had a lot of course, health struggles. in her lifetime. So I thought, I'm going to call my paper, I'm not really sure what it's about, but I'm going to call it Wilma's Jingle Dress. And so I showed up and I started doing work, and I started wondering, well, what is the history, as historians tend to do? How long have we been doing this? What's the story behind the jingle dress? And we tell a story in Ojibwe communities about the origin of the jingle dress. And the story is kind of a simple one, and it's a little girl becomes very ill, her family thinks she's near death, her father has a dream or a vision about a special dress and songs and a dance associated with it. And he makes this special dress for his daughter. And he gives her this dress and tells her, it's time to get up and you should try to get up and everything. And she does, and she's still not feeling well. But then she dances the first jingle dress dance steps, and she starts to feel better. And she kind of, she regains her health. So that's the story. You hear this up in Whitefish Bay, Ontario. You hear it in Mille Lacs. You hear it in Red Lake. It's the same story Ojibwe people tell. But I started to think, well, wonder where it came from, though. Why was this girl so sick, and what was going on? And so, so I started to look at photographs of the jingle dress, and I realized you could not find a photograph of the jingle dress before circa 1920. And I thought, well, what was going on in the United States and Canada that Ojibwe people needed to start this new tradition of healing? And it got me into looking at some of the historical literature and writings about the influenza pandemic of 1918-19. And so my theory in all of this is that the jingle dress, this was devastating to Native communities in North America. And I know they talk about in Alaska how devastating the flu epidemic was, that new orphanages started up and that sort of thing. But I thought, well, maybe this is why it happened at this particular moment. And I always I remember reading, when we started first to kind of discover that demographic story, Peter, and people started, wondering, well, how many Indians were there? And, what do we know about how they dealt with illness and devastation and epidemic? And I remember Ray Fogelson, one of our colleagues, writing in in an issue of Ethnohistory when he was president of the organization about how we don't, we're just starting to come to terms with those numbers a little more accurately, but what do we know really about the psychological dimensions and what kind of impact these epidemics had on Native people? So for me, the jingle dress is a little bit of an insight into that psychological dimension. Like how, maybe Indian people didn't cope the same way exactly in 1918 that they did in 1780 or whatever when they experienced smallpox. But maybe these traditions were very resilient and helpful to them. And maybe there is, this is why we do some of the things that we do. So I became very convinced that the jingle dress dance tradition for Ojibwe people arose during this flu epidemic of 1918-19.
Yeah, and the jingle dress tradition, I think, is an example, along with fishing, of the prominent role that women play in the Ojibwe community. And so with that in mind, I want to ask, did it surprise you as you wrote this book how large a role women played, or was this something that you knew all along and it was confirmed in the research?
This is really bad to say for a feminist who's one of the early, whose mentor was a women's historian. It sort of surprised me. And it wasn't so much that they worked hard, right? That men and women worked hard, or that women had such a large role. I didn't realize how significant I guess I would call it their legal, I started to look at where Ojibwe people harvested wild rice in lakes as being a legal system, because it was a very orderly and organized kind of work. And there were ricing committees even well before reservations that organized this kind of labor. And I started to see that water, where Ojibwe women still have a ceremonial responsibility for water, I started to see that this was, water was a very gendered space for Ojibwe people. And so it wasn't surprising to me that women had a large role in work. I just didn't understand or see the big picture of how all of Ojibwe society was organized around the work that men and women did, that you would call it a legal system. This is how it worked. It was very orderly, very efficient, and really, really key to how everything works. So that was the part that I didn't get before, right? That was the part. So you know, you're always reading these anthropologists who are saying, people that went out and did this, you know, all these activities, without really understanding the structure, right? The bigger structure of them all. And so that's what, it's taken me a while, but you know, and I'm slow in lots of ways, but it's taken me a while to see some of that structure.
Well, on that note, I have one more question before turning it over to the audience,
Sure.
which is, well, given how inspired this book is, obviously you learned a great deal about your community, about your family, about yourself, and so what is next for Brenda Child?
Oh, yeah. So this probably won't come as a surprise to you. And I was just mentioning to Joyce that I have sabbatical next year. Yay! So I'm so thrilled. But my next project is that archive, right, on the reservation. The records are there for everybody on the reservation. So I just want to kind of go in there and see what stories I run into. You know, the stories of our tribal courts, the origins of our tribal court, a lot about the history of our social service apparatus and how it developed. In that archive, there are stories of veterans. There are just you know, when I think about Red Lake, one of the things I write about in the book is my grandmother's, well, she did have a career as a bootlegger, and she had a incident where she was arrested one time related to alcohol, my lovely grandma, but she went before the tribal court. And this is a court where Indian people stand before tribal judges who are Indian people. And that's kind of an interesting idea, right? Because we're always thinking the justice is being doled out somewhere else, or the injustice, right? And so looking at those sorts of things are really interesting to me. So the next project is really just to understand a little bit more about the surveillance of Indian people on reservations. That's kind of, I mean, I think I'll run into lots of stories, but if I would describe what now that the project is, because we're used to talking about assimilation policy or policies that came from Washington or things Indian people had to do to follow policies. And what I'm really interested in with this project, because the Indian agent, you know, in the book I talk about, he wrote about my grandmother's first 2 pregnancies, right? So the intrusiveness of the agents in people's everyday lives is really quite remarkable when you see it, how it operated on a day-to-day level. So this project then I look at as kind of from the perspective of Indian people. What did it feel like to lose your freedom and to live under a system of surveillance, which is what the reservation was? So that's how I would describe the next project. And I want to do what I can, you know, in that really kind of fabulous reservation archive. The only cabinets that are locked, we need to establish policies for them, so I need to kind of organize the archive as well. But the only locked cabinets are adoption records there. And so I see it as something potentially for the benefit of the community, right? Who might have access to this, but I want to go through it first. So, and you know, people have gone, you know, they go in there and they look for things because they're business records and that sort of thing, but usually no one's kind of systematically looked at it as a kind of an archive about the everyday social history of a reservation population. And there are several thousand people in there, so I think it's really a cool archive.
Well, it's definitely a fascinating project, and we're all anxious to see the results.
Yeah, I'm excited too.
At this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to the audience for any questions or remarks Brenda's work. Phil?
When you were doing the book and you went through the archive, was that your biggest surprise, or was, as you did the book, were there other surprises that you?
Well, you know, some of the things about my grandparents, you know, I don't know that I was surprised by anything. I even, you know, I knew my grandma was a bootlegger. Like, she wasn't an active bootlegger. She was kind of retired bootlegger by the time I came along, because I'm not, you know, I'm kind of in the middle to the tail end of the grandkids. So I knew she was a bootlegger. That didn't surprise me. What surprised me? There was a story that I kind of came across in there about, there was an accidental shooting. My grandfather was involved in an accidental shooting on the reservation in 1934, where he was actually shot in the face by another man on the reservation. And we have a kind of family story about that, and it has to do with, there's another person on the reservation named Dan Needham, who was really super old when I was growing up. You know, he lived to be 90, I don't know, close to 100. And he, the story always was that he saved my grandfather's life. Well, I never questioned that, and I don't know what the details were. And this man, Dan Needham, his Ojibwe name was Ombageshig. And that name has been kind of passed around in my family, so that my own son that's his Ojibwe name, Ombageshig. It means, it doesn't mean just like early in the morning, it means like lifting the day, like the sunrise. That's what the name means. And I thought that had something to do with my grandfather, right? So when I'm in the little archive on the reservation, I see the story of his accidental shooting that this all derives from, and what role Dan Needham had, who indeed took my grandfather to the hospital and that sort of thing. So I don't know if he really saved his life. I don't think he was going to die, because in 1934, if you get shot in the face, you're probably either going to survive or die, right, without whatever the medical intervention was on the reservation at the time. So the story is that my grandfather was, and he was very short. He was 5'4". It was dusk, and he was out walking, and he was coming home, and there's another guy in town named Joe Brown, in our same little hometown there in Red Bee on the reservation. And Joe Brown saw my grandfather at a distance. He was out hunting and thought my grandfather was a bear, and he shot him. And then my grandfather, I know what he yells out. He yells out on Ojibwe, like, he says, like, Niji, like, friend, what the heck, you're killing me. And so there's an affidavit from Joe Brown. There's one from my grandfather. Joe and my grandfather probably both, their statements probably were taken in Ojibwe and then translated. The police have their statements. My great-grandfather's still alive over at White Earth. He comes over and makes a statement. So it's just interesting to see all these documents about this accidental shooting on the reservation. And I always tease, right now we're at Red Lake, where we are writing a new constitution, and I'm on this, there are 12 of us who are members of this committee writing our new constitution at Red Lake. And one of the people on the committee is Sheldon Brown, who's Joe Brown's grandson. And I always tease him, and I always say, Sheldon, you know, I forgive your grandfather for shooting my grandfather. And I always kind of joke about that. But so it's just funny, the things you're surprised by lots of things, even though sometimes we have bits of the story, right? Because we hear these things in our family, but we don't know what the whole story. I had, and this happened 4 years before my mother was born, so she didn't have all the details of the story. So it's just fun what you run into.
As you pointed out, the word labor is sort of problematic in dealing with this period, because in the modern sense, labor is something you go do for someone else and get paid for, right? It's work you do for someone else and get paid for. Whereas what the kind of labor work you're describing is just basic survival. So I'm just curious, first of all, did people this time, did Ojibwe people this time work at all in the white economy? Did they do jobs for which they were paid and got money? And when did they sort of transition, if they have transitioned into sort of the modern view of labor?
Well, I guess I would disagree with some of the way you're defining labor, but there are, it's interesting, and this is another statement that people who kind of have grown up in reservation communities would understand about the nature or the history of the work Indian people have done. For example, on our reservation, there was a sawmill. And this sawmill, because we're in northern Minnesota, we're in the middle of a boreal forest, right? So there are pine trees and red pines and white pines, and of course loggers and timber companies wanted access to all that, as did the federal government. So the federal government in the early years of our reservation managed our lumber company, our lumber industry on the reservation. And the thing about it, and this is the other thing about how Indian people had to struggle kind of to survive. This was a company, a business operated by the United States government, supposedly on behalf of the Indian people. But you really couldn't get a job at the lumber company if you were an Indian up until well after World War II. So in later years, my grandfather worked for wages as worked at the sawmill on the reservation. So did my uncles. My grandmother, for a time, seemed to have had a office job up there doing that. But there's something peculiar, that many of us who know about the history of Indian reservations and how the federal government has kind of managed our businesses, that those resources were leaving the community, and there was some compensation. But this, Red Lake is a very large reservation, and we were never allotted, so we never lost our land. And so it's interesting to think that you have a labor force all around you, right? That Indian people couldn't get work there. It was a good paying job. And so it took decades for Indian people to become employed because the government was deciding who got jobs and the managers. And so Indian people were excluded from this. It's ridiculous. It's an absurd idea. But they couldn't for many years, or they were not employed at their own sawmill on the reservation. So there are just some things that are very interesting when you look at the history of Indian reservations, and when you look at, you think, wow, they had this business, they had fishing, they had, and there's another whole story that I try to tell about the state of Minnesota's management of our fishing industry. But many of the best jobs on the reservations went to non-Indian people, which is another thing that kept Indian people poor, even as they worked in, as you call it, kind of modern ways of laboring. They were excluded from that whole area of work.
I have a question. You said something about you want to talk about labor of healing.
Yes.
And I wanted to know
Right.
if you could. I would like to know more about that. The labor of healing.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is another thing. We probably wouldn't look at, many people wouldn't look at that as a kind of labor, but of course healing, working in medical professions or having knowledge of plants and healing people is a kind of occupation for a lot of people. So it was, I wanted to kind of take that very seriously and to think about the people with that particular kind of expertise, in reservation communities. So there were lots of men and women who worked as healers and had this kind of knowledge. And so, but I, found the jingle dress was one way to kind of talk about the labor of healing. But I kind of follow through on that story. And again, some of this has to do with just my particular fascination with the flu epidemic of 1918. But I came across on the National Archives website a number of years ago a letter that I thought was just one of those great, great documents. And it was written by a woman described as a volunteer nurse working in Washington, D.C. during the flu epidemic. And the National Archives had it on their website, not because of anything related to Indian people or Indian women. It was just a great document of Washington and the social history of Washington during the flu epidemic. And, you know, she talked about the quarantines and working in a hospital and seeing people die, you know, and young people, young men especially, dying in the military hospitals out there. And her letter, she was had been a student at Haskell. And so I thought, who is this person? And so her last name was Lucient. The whole letter is in the book. Her last name was, or her first name was Lucient. That was the only thing I knew about her. And I thought, I'm going to have to write a whole book about the flu epidemic just to use this woman's fabulous letter. You know, it's just like a movie. It was such a fantastic letter. So I finally thought, I'm going to have to just figure out who she is. I had no idea who she was. So I knew she was at Haskell. So I went through the old newspapers until I found a picture of her. But I just went on a whim, looked at the census of the early 20th century census, using a first name, right? And she came up in the census of 1910 based on her first name. If she had been named Mary, I never would have found her. And then, this was the exciting part, she was from Rosome, Minnesota, just north of Red Lake. And those were the people who lived off, like on allotted lands right off Red Lake, north of our people, you know. And she was had a French, very mixed up family circumstances. I don't know. She was mixed blood. They could never determine, you know, what her parentage actually was in terms of her father when she went away to boarding school. But I just thought she fit into my story. So I kind of start out then talking about women as healers in the community and the different healing work they did. I talk about the origin of the jingle dress dance tradition, and then I end up with this Lucient working in this military hospital during the flu epidemic. And to me, it was a way of talking about modernity, right? That if you look at someone like Lucient, who'd been to boarding school and she's mixed blood and she's living in the city, who knows if she ever came back to Minnesota, you would think, oh, that's a, you know, modern Indian person. But really, her life was affected by the same thing as the jingle dress dancers, right? They're all modern people engaging in, you know, the circumstances and the changing times of the early 20th century. So I kind of like those, you know, putting those stories together about healing. So that's how I do it, kind of through looking at healers, the jingle dress, and then this story of Lucient. So after the book was published, I couldn't find anything. I had a thick file on her from Haskell, and I learned all about the details of her early life, and her mother had died, and she went to boarding school. It's kind of a very sad story. And then I couldn't really find her anymore after the flu epidemic. She wrote, first I thought, oh my God, did she die in the flu epidemic? I was all worried about it. And then I found she had written one last letter, maybe it was 1923, back to Haskell, and she wanted her transcripts because she planned to go to George Washington University. So she was still out east. So I kind of left it there thinking, okay, she survived the flu epidemic. And then sadly, after the book came out, someone wrote to me, someone with better genealogy skills than I have, and showed me her death certificate, that she had still died in her early 20s after getting married and changing her name, which is probably why I couldn't find her surname after that. So she had still died young. And it seems like in the aftermath of childbirth, which also had happened to her mother. So it was sort of a sad story, but anyway, but she's there, right? We can think of her interesting life, and her letter is, like I say, one of the great documents of the flu epidemic.
Sounds like she might be worthy of a book of her own.
She's a pretty fantastic character for me. Yeah, I really loved writing about Lucient. Mm-hmm.
Any more questions? If not, then I'm going to conclude our event this morning. Thank you, Dr. Child, for this wonderful interview. Thank you for being such a fabulous audience. And so I think there's still food and drink available. And so please stay and enjoy yourselves.
Thank you.
Visit with Dr. Child, and thank you again. Appreciate it.